Good morning, and thank you to Sedex for hosting this event. And I suppose the opening sessions have been very inspirational in the fact that we are seeing Sedex talk about the professionalism that we need to address this, but also recognizing there's a lot to do. And I think that when we think about the amount of money that criminals earn around the world, because this is actually a crime when we're talking about the issues of human trafficking and modern slavery, and the learning we've had around other responses to other standards that we've introduced, whether that's health and safety or food standards, we've still got a long way to go. But as the previous speaker from the CNA Foundation spoke, we are starting to find the solutions. So the panel today is particularly good to discuss this in a wide context. And joining me on the panel is Allard, who is the Senior Sustainability Manager with MACE Consultancy Business. Obviously looking at it from the construction side and having a unique opportunity to talk about what they can do, but the challenges that are there. And I've got Virginie Mahin, who's the Global Social Sustainability and Human Rights Lead for Mondelez, looking at particularly high-risk industries in some way, chocolate producers working globally in that sector. And then we've got Colleen Theron, who is a tri-qualified solicitor and the founder of Ardea International, who specializes and provides sustainable businesses with human rights solutions, and particularly with modern slavery challenges. And Dr. Aidan McQuade, who was the CEO of Anti-Slavery International until recently. Aidan has had a lifetime of dealing with human rights violations in Angola and beyond, and actually led a lot of the push to get a Modern Slavery Act through his role as the CEO of Anti-Slavery International. And what we're going to look at today is we're going to talk about these issues in the real, what we heard, outputs to outcomes, thinking about driving transformational change and what needs to happen, and thinking about, is it enough to just think it will happen, or do we have to do positive things? So if the panel could join me up on the stage, we can start the session. So by way of introduction, what I'm going to do is ask each person to, over about 5 minutes, talk about their challenges in their particular issues and how they see that they have a role to play in addressing, and how we move this from outputs to outcomes. So, Ian, as a B2B company, what are some of the challenges that you see facing the construction industry and actually getting that outcomes driven?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Just first of all, glad I don't have any slides today. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Allard, I'm from MACE. MACE are an international construction and consultancy company. And among many challenges that we have, I wanted to mainly focus on the people challenge that we have as a business-to-business organization. I know that's been a common theme so far. First off, just wanted to sort of throw a bit of a stat out at you. Sort of in the construction industry, by 2024, we're going to need 1 million new workers. That's 1 million new workers that we currently don't have in the construction industry that we're going to have to find somehow. Now, I just want to have a little think about the pressure that actually puts on training, attracting, and recruiting that 1 million workers. And when we sort of start to think about how that interacts with what Leslie was just saying on transparency and accountability, on construction sites, we can have as many as 5, 6, 7, 8 tiers of contractor on site. Now, we as MACE, as a principal contractor, a first-tier contractor, try and maintain standards across recruitment, across responsible sourcing. But when we get down to that 6th, 7th tier, and we also know that the demand for this 1 million workers exists, how actually do we ensure that these workers are being responsibly recruited and brought into the construction industry, particularly when we know in the UK those workers don't exist? So where are those workers coming from? How are they being recruited? What standards are in place? So that is a massive challenge for us as a first-tier contractor and shared by many other first-tier contractors. And just sort of thinking a little bit around, we've mentioned about outputs to outcomes. The main focus of the whole construction industry sort of over the last 50 years has really been around safety and driving improvements in the safety of our workers on site. Very much so to the point where we've improved so much now that you are 10 times more likely to commit suicide on a construction site than you are to die from a construction-related incident. So 2 big challenges there that are drawing on people. We need lots more people, and then we need to take better care of them when we actually get them into our industry. And they are the main things that I think are common across the construction industry and perhaps aren't the first things you would think of when thinking of construction itself.
We'll come back to this after, but from my own perspective, in construction, that was what my father worked in, having come from Ireland in the 50s and working on the construction, and then, did quite well. But he would say the changes from when he started to when he retired in health and safety were phenomenal. And I think that's a good example for the construction industry of where change can be there. But I think moving on, we've heard it mentioned, we've got the Modern Slavery Act, we've got the Australian legislation, which is a bit more tighter than the UK legislation. We've got the French due diligence. We've got the Tariff Act in the US of 1930. We've got legislation in Brazil. Now, Virginie, Mondelez is outspoken about the need for human rights and legislation at the EU level. And so why would it be that a business themselves are asking for regulation? It seems kind of a bit odd.
Sure. First, let me just tell you a little bit more about Mondelez for those who might not know us so well. We're a global snacking company. We make a lot of chocolate like Cadbury here in the UK, brands like Milka over on the continent, but also biscuits like Oreo, Lu, and so on. We operate in 160 countries across the world. We have more than 80,000 employees who work for us. And we source the ingredients for our chocolate and our cookies from global supply chains all over the world. So that's cocoa, wheat, sugar, palm oil, a lot of complicated supply chains that span many countries. And that link us, importantly, to hundreds of thousands of people. As a company, we're committed to making our snacks the right way, and what we mean by that is protecting the planet and respecting the human rights of the people in our value chain. Sourcing and manufacturing our products in that way is very much a journey of continuous improvement. Our impact team, which includes a few people, such as myself, but much more importantly, champions that are embedded throughout the different functions within the company, work every day to improve our practices and those of our many, many suppliers. And of course, we don't work alone. Many of the issues that we're facing in our supply chains are systemic in nature and require collective action with industry peers, but also often with governments, with civil society. And that's why we're very active in a number of industry platforms, like Gain Progress, the Consumer Goods Forum, Sedex, of course, but also multi-stakeholder platforms. For example, in the cocoa supply chain, where I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a big problem of child labor in the supply chain in West Africa, where most of the cocoa is grown. And that's something that we work on very much as a company, but also crucially together with producing governments and our industry peers and civil society through a platform that's called the International Cocoa Initiative. But so to get back to your question, Kevin, if companies are doing a lot, and many of us are, why not just stick to voluntary measures? Why ask for legislation? I realize it still comes as a surprise to some, but there's very good reasons for business to advocate for legislation that creates the right incentives for companies to take action on the ground in their supply chains and for governments to fulfill their good governance duties. At Mondelez, as you mentioned, we've been calling on the European Union in particular, where we're a US-based company, but 40% of our revenue is here in Europe. I can still say that, here in Europe. Yes, we would like the EU to adopt due diligence legislation for 3 key reasons. One, running robust due diligence systems throughout your value chain has a significant cost. I'm sure this is not news to most of you in this room. And legislation is necessary to create a level playing field, because no business should be able to get a competitive advantage from skipping those costs. Second good reason to want legislation, businesses need legal clarity, and in this case, a harmonized EU solution. Today's legislative landscape, as was mentioned earlier today by a number of speakers, includes kind of a patchwork at European level. You have the UK Modern Slavery Act, you have a law in France, you have some cropping up in different countries, and they all have somewhat different scopes, different requirements, and that just makes it quite complex within a company. It kind of it risks creating a bit of more bureaucracy within the company, looking to make sure that you report according to the requirements, rather than incentivizing action and often the collective action that's necessary to address the risks that are found in the supply chain. And finally, third and most important reason, this kind of legislation could significantly contribute to the mainstream adoption of sustainable practices, and not just by consumer-facing companies, but also actors along the supply chain, maybe more like your company, who face different kinds of pressures, but less pressure from consumers, but also from investors in the case of private companies. So this is why, these are the three main reasons why we've been calling for due diligence at EU level. Yeah, and I look forward to discussing some more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Virginie. And so, you know, as I said, for a company to call for more regulation to make that level playing field, and I think look at other things like construction, where you have got level playing fields around health and safety and other regulations, even from fitting electricity supplies and so forth. But Colleen, looking at it from the law perspective and the different regulations and laws and the mandatory reporting, what is effective and where is this going? What are the outcomes at the moment that are making change, or where are the deficits?
Okay. So thank you very much to Sedex for inviting me to be here today. As you heard, I'm a qualified lawyer, but run a business called Ardea International, and we partner with Sedex, which we're proud of, to really help drive improvement and help you with tools and learning around these issues. And I mean, thank you to Virginie for raising this point about some businesses really looking for a level playing field in regulation, because that's not something we always hear. And what we've definitely seen has been alluded to, has this tremendous growth in regulation across the globe. And what we're seeing is, as Virginie said, is a real patchwork. So we have human rights transparency being driven for the reasons that have been raised, that people want to see responsible sourcing. But actually, from a government perspective, it's actually a preferred tool, because if you think about it, you are asking organizations to self-regulate and to report on the way that they are actually behaving in their organizations and supply chains. And so what we're seeing is, you know, this trend in the mandatory legislation saying to business, you have to report, not necessarily with enforcement action that is attached to that. And we're having different levels of requirements being asked of business, which is definitely causing a challenge for global businesses who are finding themselves subject to different reporting standards. And an example of that might be under the Modern Slavery Act or under the California Transparency Supply Chains Act, is you have just the requirement to report in the form of a statement, possibly around some of the steps that you're taking to combat modern slavery. On the other hand, we're seeing growth in legislation that is actually asking business to identify the risks in their supply chains and to see what they're doing about it. So there is a requirement to actually provide more information on the due diligence that's been taken. And that's another interesting point around that, is that it's not just talking about forced labor and human rights issues. but actually environmental impacts as well. And I can see that as an emerging trend going forward, there's going to definitely be, I think, more linking around these environmental issues and human rights issues. And from a business perspective, I think where that possibly might drive some change is to stop the silo effect. And if you are developing or have mature systems around environmental due diligence, if you're a company that has environmental impacts as well as human rights impacts, to start thinking about how you actually amalgamate those issues. The other trend that we're seeing around the development in this regulatory landscape is a sort of third trend, which is demonstrated by the French Vigilance Act, was actually how you might attach corporate accountability to corporate liability and putting some penalties possibly in place. Now, we saw the scrapping in the Vigilance Act of civil penalties, but actually the thinking and in the Swiss movement of this is to tie these two things together. So the impact of that will be in greater enforcement by civil action against companies. So we'll see more parent liability cases, which we are seeing, which is definitely driving change in some of the bigger corporates about how they actually manage these things. And I think the other thing I just wanted to talk about around the landscape of legislation is that we shouldn't perhaps underestimate the impact that the UNGPs are still having in transforming change. So I was really interested to see Sedex's vision and Mark's point about how, a lot of the work will still be tied into the UNGPs, because as a voluntary framework, it's going to give you a lot of information about how to deal with things like leverage and complicity and going about your due diligence. So I hope that gives you a landscape view of what's going on.
And I think if we're looking at outcomes, the fact that we've got a BBC presenter saying that when buying furniture, she did some checks, shows that the work of Sedex is working, that it's actually getting to the decisions that people make every day, which is actually, I think, what we're trying to do, improve the lives of somebody by a phone call going in saying, where did that wood come from? Well, we can tell you that, but what about the people? There comes the question mark. So in that context, we always say it's difficult to see where the people are. We talk about supply chains. Yet, for example, this year we introduced, or last year, a flight that goes from Perth to London non-stop. And for the 30 years that aircraft is commissioned, every bit of history about that plane will be known, from passengers, from fuel, from maintenance, every single part of that plane, but also the other 25,000 planes that grace our skies every day. We will know all about that. But we can't tell where the child is who's mined the coltan or the cobalt for the batteries that are in the base of the aircraft. In some ways, if we actually think about that, we can do it if we decide to do it. So you have seen this firsthand, Aidan. Your human rights focus is very much about the reality, but you've driven for a strategic change and a systemic change. But where do you see where we've got things moving forward, but where the big change needs to be? What is going to be the thing that is going to change it so that that child down the mine in the Congo at the moment, who is mining for the batteries in the bottom of that plane, or for our mobile phones, or for our computers, how are we going to get it that we can actually deal with those situations in a systems approach?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Kevin, in talking about the systems approach, and it's important to bear in mind that the system we're talking about is the political economy. So it's the laws, policies, customs that we use in order to guide the way in which we do business, and the way in which we conduct employment, and the way in which we conduct trade, both nationally and internationally. And currently, that is less than ideal in the world. So this is why it's important that we are beginning to think about new laws and policies around this, and it's a tribute to companies like Mondelez that they are calling for new laws and policies in order to try and address these things. Because that's the only time governments listen. I mean, if you look at two of the major engagements over the past 10 years, we have the Bangladesh Fire Safety Accords, which emerged as a result of the Rana Plaza atrocity, and we have the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. Now, both of those arose directly because business made demands on government to bring in place new law and regulation. businesses who were sourcing from Bangladesh understood that they needed that systemic change, which only government can drive, and so they put pressure on government to bring that about. You know, the stories that are told whenever business first went to meet the Home Office over the Modern Slavery Act, asking for regulation, and that was that the officials and ministers present initially burst out laughing at the thought that business was asking for regulation. But for the reason that Virginie alluded to of trying to level the playing field, businesses who are trying to do the right thing here recognized that they needed some regulation in order to ensure that they weren't undercut by unscrupulous competitors. And one of the positive benefits, which I'm not sure is known widely at the moment, is that the introduction of the Bangladesh Safety Accords has led to an increase in inward investment in Bangladesh by, I think, 5-fold. I was speaking to somebody from ASOS a few weeks ago who quoted the figure like something like a 5-fold increase in inward investment into Bangladesh because companies can be more assured of the safety standards within Bangladesh. So there's an economic upside for human rights protections, which is a new and surprising idea for much business and many countries who up until now have been building their competitive advantage on the idea of being able to provide cheap labor. And you know, that's why businesses are going to Southeast Asia and other places like that, is because they know the labor is cheap, and the governments there are keeping the labor cheap through human rights abuses in order to keep business coming in. So Bangladesh is a positive example in that of the possibilities which emerge whenever human rights standards are protected. But again, it comes back to the question of, well, why have we got that? And again, we have that because business demanded it. You know, the original conception by Adam Smith was that it was the role of the state to regulate businesses. But I think we're all pretty clear at the moment that most politicians, unless it is in some irrational, xenophobic, crazy, fundamentalist notion like Brexit, but most politicians think that their role is to ask business how they wish to be regulated. And they will be terrified at regulating in a way which is not acceptable to business. I mean, the idea of transparency laws in the UK were being pushed by NGOs and trade unions for many years before the Modern Slavery Act came into place. The reason it's on the statute books now is because business came behind that as well. Now, you can do all you like with audits, but until you get changes in law and policy, you're going to have abuses in your supply chains. And you can do all you like with law and policy until you have a mature systems of industrial relations within your supply chains, particularly the recognition and involvement in trade unions in what you're doing, you're going to have problems within your supply chains. There needs to be a recognition of those political economic realities and no skirting around them by trying to buy snake oil solutions which aren't going to address those fundamental issues. I think that's the big challenge at the moment in driving change.
So, I mean, if we look at the things that are there, things that are changing, for example, at the EU, there is going to be the conflict minerals legislation coming in 2021, which is, you know, going to be essential to talk about the things like the cobalt and so forth, albeit it's not covering all of the elements that need to be covered. But I suppose we need to think about this in the sense of, you know, you mentioned regulation there, Aidan. For example, in our schools or in our education system or in our health, we have regulation from the top down to the bottom, and we have ways of addressing it as members of the communities, people the services are there for. And if we thought that someone in our school system or our education system was being abused, there would be an enormous response to that. But if we look in the supply chains, it seems to be fairly regular that this is happening. So why is that the case? And Aidan touched on some of that there. And I just want to point out at this point as well, but I'm not confident on the IT, that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions in the last 5 minutes online if that system is working. We'll see if it is. Otherwise, we might have to go to shouting from the floor. But But with all that in mind and what you've said, and the panel have come with a position really, is reputational brand damage enough to drive change? And the fear of that, particularly from your business?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly for MACE and other tier 1 contractors, as a business-to-business organisation, reputation is really everything to us. I just talked about the challenges of attracting talent. Nobody wants to work for an organisation that is associated with modern slavery. We need new people to come in from other industries into construction. It's not most people's first choice of industry. I'm not even sure how I end up here half the time. But and also for our clients, we worked with some very large names, some very big clients. Their reputation is key to us as well, and our reputation and winning work and the way we operate very much is key to us staying as a business. So anything that we can do to improve our reputation certainly drives transformational change. And the way we tend to go about it is exactly what this conference is about. We quantify every single outcome from natural capital to social capital that we produce. So if we run a 1,000-hour volunteer program, we'll translate that into an economic, monetized value, and we will shout about how much we've improved that community, that area, that project. It's great from a moral imperative. As a company, we're doing the right thing. From a business perspective, we're showing the value we're adding. So for us, reputation really is the key to making change.
So the reputation is important, but is that going to drive the change? And for example, if I ask you, Colleen, for example, in some industries, the expectation is that the employee pays for that job, and the employer pays principal, and it's always going to be the lowest paid who has to pay for their job and then gets into debt bondage. And that is something that happens regularly. So, and we've got the ILO, protocols, which are not signed up by many of the G20 countries, for example. So how are we going to drive this so that the reputation, can a company just say, well, our reputation is so important that we're going to kind of do this, or does it need some systems approach and regulation?
I mean, I think that what we see across the board is, and we see this in terms of meeting compliance as well as managing reputational risk, is that there's very definitely those companies that are leading at the top end of this, who have the brands and who are really concerned about the risk to their reputation, will address it. I think what we also see is a tremendous laggard in so many companies where that doesn't really matter. So to answer your question, how do you really get change? Well, it can't come, I don't think, unless you have cultural governance change within a business, whether that's a small SME or whether it's a large family-owned business. There needs to be an internal transformative change in terms of how people lead for actual impact, I guess. I mean, and one of the things that we are seeing, though, is there are changes being made to governance codes in the UK and across the globe. And I wonder if, part of the reason for the drive in that is really to ensure that directors are operating properly to their shareholders, taking into account how they manage the environmental and social impacts. And that might be, one of the areas that we might see change is through the governance frameworks more than just reputational damage.
And Virginie, for you, being a company that's calling for more regulation and accountability, where should the culpability lay? What should it look like? Should it be sanction that you go on a list where you can't trade? Should it be financial penalty? Should it be where you could face imprisonment? So where do you think that should lay, and what should it look like if we're really going to make this change?
I think what's for sure is you do need some kind of enforcement. What it should look like exactly, I think this is kind of where we would turn back to policymakers to figure it out. But I think it's important to look at it both from the stick and the carrot perspective. Also make sure that the legislation looks to incentivize action, so not only get companies in kind of a defensive mode, trying to protect themselves from lawsuits, but make sure that companies also have the necessary kind of confidence and space that they can be transparent about, not only risk, but actual impacts in their supply chains, and be given the space, the time to actually deal with those issues. I mean, finding the issue is often the easy part, solving it. Having worked now for many years in our cocoa sustainability program, in particular on child labor in the cocoa supply chain, there's no lack of will and investment from industry to solve the issue. Nonetheless, it's very, very far from being solved. Not to say that maybe industry shouldn't be doing more, but just to give you an example of the kind of issues that companies need to deal with, and the fact that legislation needs to recognize that. That's why sometimes, we've been talking about, a safe harbor, or finding, the way to give that confidence to companies that they can be transparent. We've talked a lot about transparency this morning, and I agree, that's very necessary to even starting to solve the issues and getting together for collective action and working together with governments. But companies are unlikely to take those steps and be transparent if they fear that the second they're transparent, they're actually exposing themselves. So you need to find the right balance between those two things.
And I think that's the difficulty, finding that balance sometimes. And I think, the companies, the very things that we spoke about this morning was finding this. And if you find it and then you get penalized, well, what's the point in finding it? So I think it's a very clear point. But from your point, Aidan, where is that line? Where is it? How can you draw out and say, well, that company's looking and found, that company's sitting there in silence looking the other way? Where can that line be drawn, and how can you measure that? Because it's really difficult to measure.
I think there's a couple of indicators you can look at, and the first one you've actually indicated straight away, which is who's being silent. Because it is the companies that are being silent who are facilitating most of this. There's a lot of attention is now being paid to the companies which are saying stuff. But the companies that are being silent are probably the ones who are facilitating most of the thing. When I'm talking about being silent, I'm not just saying, yes, we've got a problem, which many companies are beginning to do now, or yes, we have a risk, but it's a more fundamental question of what's the causality of those risks. And, there is an opportunity to speak about this within the modern slavery statement. I have not come across a modern slavery statement which yet does that. Because if you're sourcing from, for example, Thailand seafood, one of the reasons that you've got problems, will have problems in your supply chain, relate to Thai government policy, treatment of migrants, lack of labor inspection, lack of fishing boats inspections. There's a constellation of issues there. Some of which are specific to the industry, but many of which are general to anybody who is sourcing from Thailand. Migrants to Thailand have a rough time getting decent work, and that's a result of policy. Now, very few companies are talking about that openly, and it's only whenever they start to talk about those causality issues in the same way as businesses engaged with Bangladesh over the issues of causality around factory safety, that you have any prospect of getting any of the policy changes and implemented that are necessary in order to start reducing the risks. So silence is one issue which I think it's worthwhile judging companies on, and I'm looking at all of you because frankly I don't think any of you are speaking about these issues. The second one I think which is important is, what do you do whenever you find an issue? So do you look the other way? Do you try and cover it up? That still seems to be standard practice for a lot of businesses. Or do you engage with it explicitly and say, okay, not only how do we remedy the problem that is faced by the person or people that we've identified in line with the UN guiding principles which have our requirement for remedy in them, but can we understand what's the system which has caused these problems in the first place? Because they're usually systemic issues that are giving rise to any specific abuses that you'll come across. And so if you go down to that next level of trying to change the system as opposed to simply remedy the person's injury, which should happen, then again, I think that's another solid basis for judging companies on. But companies need to sort of step up. You need to grow courage about this because you're either going to act on the issue or the issue is going to act on you. And I think if you can find some agency around this, that you become leaders in this issue, and that means not just fixing that which is within your control and power within your own business operations or within those aspects of the supply chain that you have, but also start to engage with the questions of law and policy around that. Then I think you're going to be failing in this issue. And I think it's also important to bear in mind, I'll just say this again, I say it every time people ever come, invite me here, which is about once every 5 years, because once they've forgotten what I said the last time. Audits don't fix this stuff. In fact, audits can contribute to the problems. I was in Burma a couple of months ago speaking to factory workers there. All young women, none of whom are going to be employed past the age of 26 because they can't work fast enough on the supply chains to do this. So between the age of 16 and 26, they have to try and accumulate enough savings in order to pay off the family debt which they've inherited, which is giving rise to a lot of their exploitation. And one of the points of compulsion on them for putting up with dreadful, dreadful working conditions is it said to them, the auditor's coming around next week. So you have to tell them, yes, there's air conditioning all the time. Yes, the women's toilets are lovely. Yes, the food in the canteen's fantastic. Yes, we never work really serious overtime here. Otherwise, we're not going to get the contract with a nice and ethical brand that's selling in California and Europe, and you're going to go out of jobs. So they all dutifully comply with fulfilling the expectations of the auditors when they come round. So there's not just that question of what's going on in the workplace, but can you talk to people outside the workplace, and can you understand the reasons that they're in vulnerable positions for exploitation in the first place? One needs to engage this issue with a much greater level of understanding in order to take a much greater level of leadership on it.
Thank you. Ian, your company does big projects, and for example, the stadium that opened yesterday or in Tottenham was your work, and being an Arsenal supporter, that gives me no pleasure whatsoever. But that said, the building of that site, when you look at it, it's iconic. The planning that went into it, the structures, it is a new brand in a sense of what a stadium can look like and what a stadium can do. And you have a lot of staff and at different levels that come in to do all that work. And the complexity that goes into that, the planning around, what grade the concrete is, what steels you use, is, the amount of expertise that go into that is incredible. But what actually goes into the same looking at the staff? For health and safety, you have to, for the qualifications, but the recruitment of those staff, where they come from, how they are found, how they are sourced. Is that part of your day-to-day business, or is that outsourced, and then that makes it vulnerable?
Yeah, very much so. And I think just to put this into some context, the sort of issue of modern slavery in construction to a lot of construction companies is fairly new. We're sort of talking in the last 5 years in the build-up to the Modern Slavery Act. There's probably an element of, it's nothing really to do with us, this doesn't happen on our sites. And it's only in those last 5 years that we've actually started to realise, actually we're a high-risk industry. And when we're talking about big projects, the labour on our construction sites, not specifically the Tottenham project, but on our construction sites is contracted out, and it does come from a third, fourth tier supplier. Just to get into the complexity slightly, on the Tottenham job, we're actually in construction management. So it's the client who does all the procurement of goods, labour, services, and MACE advise. So our role in that capacity is very much to advise our clients on the best ways to tackle issues like modern slavery. How can we, in terms of recruitment, work with organisations like Clearview, who we've been speaking to, and David's in the room somewhere, he'll give me a backhander for this, I hope. But we're very much here as an industry to learn from you guys, from apparel, from textiles, from food, from chocolate. We're very much open to, learning. We're a private organisation. We're here to, make change quickly.
And I think what I'm saying is it's not pointing the finger at you as an industry. What I'm saying is you've got such levels of expertise on everything you do, and the outcomes are so professional, and you can see that, is this area of recruitment and people and staff, you know, how can it be incorporated more into the business model of, you know, the day-to-day work, or is it? You know, and I suppose, you know, that would be something I'd ask Virginie from their side. Is it part of your business as usual approach, part of your procurement, part of your HR, part of your day-to-day, you know, health and safety policies? Is it in every part of your business, or is it something that's just over there that you go to when you need to?
It's part of it everywhere. That's the intent anyway. We're still building that internal capacity and improving every day. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that we have it all figured out. It's not the case. But I think this is where you know, platforms like Sedex can really help. Companies are also, we're looking for that guidance and to figure out what the best practices are. We shouldn't have to each find it out on our own. So yeah, I would encourage Sedex, since we're here, to continue to help us in that direction.
So we've got 5 minutes left. I don't know if the IT is working and if we've got any questions on the system. I'm waiting to see if that's possible. Yeah. So here we go. We're going to try this live polling again, I think. Mark, we'll try this time. Is reputational brand damage sufficient to drive change, or does it need to be more? So make your choices now and see where we are on that. Do we think that's sufficient from what you've heard? Yeah. So I'm not sure that the system's working. Here we go. Okay, so we've got a very clear answer there, that there needs to be more done, which is very clear of what the drivers need to be. I think our next question on the poll is there any transparency initiatives in the pipeline that can cover suppliers beyond the current fashion industry scope? I don't know if... No?
It's almost working.
Okay.
I was redoing the last one.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Okay. So some of the questions we've got from the audience here. A question for Aidan. What is your advice to companies who want to influence legislative systems when working in places like Mexico, where there is obviously poor practices? If we could just have that quickly.
I think, first of all, establish an alliance with NGOs and trade unions in order to actually talk about what the shape and form of that should be. Obviously, I mean, within countries like Mexico, if anybody has ever read Michaela Wrong's book, I Return to Eat, about Kenya, whenever you're at an elite level there's often the chance to inappropriately influence policy and legislation. So what you want to try and do is establish some sort of democratic system. So if you're looking at tripartite mechanisms like such as drawing together trade unions, businesses, and NGOs in order to discuss what's the framework of reform that's necessary, that would be the beginning of it, and then act with a collective voice. The risk obviously is as your coalition gets wider, your demands have to become narrower so that you come on one or two things that everybody can agree on. But you know, the narrowness of the focus, if you get sufficient weight behind it and are hitting the most influential things, that can lead to significant change. I was just discussing this very issue last week in Sudan over issues of child labour in various supply chains, and again, many of the causal factors are sitting out with business controls, such as there's 2.2% of the budget is spent in education compared to 75% of the national budget which is spent on the military. I mean, that's a major issue if you want to get to address education.
Just come in with a quick question when we're cutting down time now, but it's a question that's been asked, and if I could put it to you, Colleen, and very quickly, if your answer could be, What incentives, in your opinion, must be given to encourage suppliers to provide supplier information? We can have that in less than a minute, please.
To provide supplier information.
Yeah. The incentives.
Well, if they're not legislation incentives, they're going to have to be incentives that are economic, I would have thought. And so, you know, it is about, I guess, your contracts and, you know, how you can incentivize suppliers through longer term relationships, through better buying practices and possibly longer term relationships, because those seem to be the things that on any scale are part of the problem.
So I think you've heard from the panel here. There are a number of questions that come through which have come up as the discussion here, which hopefully people can ask members of the panel during coffee break or whatever. But I think the one thing that's come out, and perhaps the poll showed it, is that everybody realizes there's much more to do. And I think the moral compass is what companies like Sedex and the CNA Foundation are looking to reset. The moral compass whereby the business that we do in our part of the world isn't done at the cost of somebody else in the other part of the world or even in our country. Because actually, isn't it just shocking that in order for us to live the lives that we have, someone somewhere else has to suffer? And I think that's the clarity that's come from today and from the vote we got from the floor, is that the work that's being done here is actually the private sector, the businesses, taking the role in many ways of what governments and others should be doing about creating moral standards, moral platforms, so that business is something that makes communities, whether that's local, whether that's national or international, places that thrive and create the equality that we need across the world. And if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which businesses pushed for, the test of those in 2030, if business plays their part and does the things that Sedex and the CNA Foundation and others are talking about achieving, that will be the biggest way of achieving those SDGs. And the other thing that we and the business group and communities must hold to account is like the G20 nations, who control 85% of the world's economy and 2/3 of the world's population. And last year, this was included in Argentina in the outcomes document of the G20. So we need to make sure that businesses with their influence push governments, push internationally, so that this becomes the norm, so that actually it isn't the norm to have slavery or exploitation in supply chains. So I've been really enthused by the panel here with Ian, Colleen, Virginie and Aidan, and I hope you have, and I hope you've taken something away from this. But thank you to Sedex for hosting this conference, and look forward to speaking to many of you today. Thank you very much.